Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Ireland. For those who are looking in live stream, welcome to Dublin, and most especially welcome to RCSI on Friday, the 15th of November 2019. This is a Guinness World Record attempt, and it is hosted to coincide with the 80th anniversary commemoration that is International Students' Day. This day commemorates annually around the world on the 17th of November events that unfolded in Prague in 1939 on November 17th. On that date, during World War II, a large number of academics and students were similarly arrested, many of them sent to concentration camps, and many of them executed for being students, for being academics, for being international. Today, the 17th of November, marks a non-political celebration of the multiculturalism of international students right across the world and the value you, as international students, bring to breaking down cultural barriers throughout international education institutions like RCSI across the world. RCSI specialises in health sciences education, and we aim to nurture and develop tomorrow's healthcare leaders. In a world marked by increasing concerns about division, RCSI students have joined forces in this activity and stand in solidarity to promote and to showcase all that is positive about international education, bringing together students from different languages, cultures, religions, and ethnic groups, all of which broadens your overall student experience, broadens our experience as workers, academics, professional staff in RCSI, and ultimately enriches Ireland's society and society in general in the process. This shows the unique community, solidarity, and unity across international lines that is present here in RCSI every day. It's important now at this time in history that we celebrate diversity of where we come from, what we stand for, and what we promote. We want to promote unity in educational and in societal settings. I am really proud of the tremendous efforts that have gone into making this world record attempt possible by all of our staff and all of you, our students. We have 60 nationalities signed up this evening. We have independent experts, and I'm very grateful to them. Anna Clark from Diabetes Ireland and Professor Donal O'Gorman from Dublin City University, who are required by the Guinness Record team as independent experts to assure us that the lecture given by Professor Sreenan is a lecture by somebody with expertise in diabetes. We have official timekeepers, Aoife Quinn and Ada Bowler, who are essential to the process as well, both qualified as Basketball Ireland Level 1 table officials, so they have that skill set. We have 2 commissioners of oaths who have confirmed your nationality as you came in, 1 solicitor, 7 independent stewards, and so all of this is being done in the spirit of true partnership, and I thank all of those people for helping our students. Thank you to our students, particularly our Students' Union, to Cathal Flood, our Undergraduate Students' Union Vice President and Societies Officer, and to Al-Mohammed Al-Jilan Dani, who's our Cultural Officer, to Rita Ibanez, who's our Postgraduate Students' Union Representative, staff from Student Services, from the Library, from Estates, from our porters, from Media Services, Communications, academic staff, and in particular, Professor Celine Marmion, whom you've just heard, who's our wonderful Deputy Dean for Student Engagement and Partnership. In terms of the topic that we wanted to choose as a health lecture, given that World Diabetes Day fell yesterday, the 14th of November, and given the international mix of students here and the importance of diabetes as an international challenge, and the fact that our alumni work in over 97 countries delivering healthcare, we felt that this is a really important topic to select. And so this is the topic students have chosen for this health awareness lesson. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Seamus Sreenan, who's consultant endocrinologist at Connolly Hospital in Dublin, and who's director of our RCSI graduate entry medical programme, the most popular graduate entry programme in Ireland. And so now I'm going to ask Al to officially ring the anatomy bell to signal the beginning of the lecture.
You look like you've been waiting a few years to ring that bell. So, well, it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, and congratulations, I hope, to all of you who are going to participate in a momentous event in the history of RCSI. And I'm delighted to be here to participate in it. I'd like to thank the Students' Union for asking me to come and talk to you today, and for choosing diabetes as the subject for the lecture in relation to this Guinness World Record attempt. So as Professor Marmion has told you, there are a number of regulations, and one of the things she told me was that I have to speak for at least 30 minutes. So anybody who's had a lecture from me on diabetes knows I never stop within 30 minutes. So we'll be here for a little bit longer than that. The outline of my lecture is on this slide. So I'll talk a little bit about the definition of diabetes. We'll talk about the classification, a little bit about the epidemiology, the pathophysiology of the main types of diabetes, the clinical features which are common to all types of diabetes, really. We'll talk a bit about treatment of, again, the main types of diabetes that we encounter, and focus a little bit on complications, which is the big burden for a lot of people living with diabetes, and talk about how we can help deal with them and prevent them, and then prevent the condition from developing in the first place. I'm going to make it a little bit interactive, if I can. So you're probably all familiar with Mentimeter. So if you have your phones handy, you can go to menti.com, and let's hope this will work. So this is just a trial question. So if you go to menti.com and put in the code 926873, you should get an opportunity to answer this question. So who is the sponsor of the Guinness Book of World Records? So if you start voting, whether it's Budweiser, Carlsberg, I've given you the answer already, Coors, Guinness, or Heineken. Let's see. We should get a pretty much 100% correct answer on this one. Somebody from the United States, perhaps, is voting for Budweiser, and somebody from Denmark. Okay, so you got the hang of it. So just to make sure that I haven't bored you to sleep intermittently during the lecture, I'll put up one or two questions like this and give you 10 or 15 seconds to answer them. So we might advance to the next one. So, and that is, what is the main hormone responsible for lowering blood glucose? Let's see how effective my lectures have been over the last couple of years. Okay, so an overwhelming majority of people here are voting for insulin. And of course, that is the correct answer. It's really the only hormone that we make in our bodies that lowers the blood glucose. But it works very closely in conjunction with a second hormone, which helps tightly regulate glucose. So insulin lowers it. The other hormone, the main function is to raise glucose. And the next question is, what is that hormone? So what hormone works with insulin to tightly control blood glucose? So again, very knowledgeable students. Maybe you actually don't need my lecture on diabetes. So excellent, because the glucagon is the correct answer there. So thank you for that. We'll move on with the talk. So this picture is a very famous physician. You probably haven't heard of him. Everybody's heard of Hippocrates, but this guy is probably almost as famous and as impactful in his day as Hippocrates. This is Areteus of Cappadocia. Does anybody know where Cappadocia is? Modern day Turkey, correct, so well done. And like all of you, Areteus went to medical school abroad. So he went to medical school in Alexandria, and then he actually ended up practicing mostly in Rome. But you can see he was practicing in around between 150 and 200 AD. So after Christ, obviously. And we do know that diabetes had been described a long time before that, so there are descriptions of it in the papyrus of the ancient Egyptians, so probably 1500 or 2000 BC. And it was really after this that the term diabetes was coined. So diabetes actually means a siphon, or something that flows through very copiously. The word mellitus was only added about 250 years ago by an English physician, Willis. So now we know diabetes as diabetes mellitus. And Aristeas was obviously very familiar with diabetes, as you can see from this description, which makes it sound pretty horrific. So the disease is chronic in its character and is slowly engendered, though the patient does not survive long when it is completely established. For the marasmus produces rapid, in other words, massive weight loss, and death speedy. Life too is odious and painful, the thirst ungovernable, and the copious potations are more than equalled by the profuse urinary discharge. For more urine flows away, and it is impossible to put any restraint to the patient's drinking or making water. For if he stop for a very brief period and leave off drinking, the mouth becomes parched, the body dry, the bowels seem on fire, he is wretched and uneasy, and soon dies tormented with burning thirst. So a pretty graphic description of the worst case scenario, really, of type 1 diabetes. So I'm sure most of you would recognize that as a description of type 1 diabetes. Because obviously insulin is not only a hormone that controls glucose, but it's an anabolic hormone. So lack of insulin will lead to breakdown of fat and protein as well. How do we define diabetes now? This is a fairly simple definition. We could use a condition characterized by hyperglycemia, obviously that means high blood sugar levels, due either to a relative or absolute deficiency of insulin, or in some cases both. It's a group of metabolic disorders that not only affects carbohydrate, but also affects lipid and protein metabolism. Now, if we talk about the glycemic definition of diabetes, and this is one of the, we don't expect students to remember too many numbers, but certainly I think we do expect students to remember the diagnostic criteria for diabetes. So we can use a number of possible criteria. So a fasting glucose of greater than or equal to 7 millimoles per liter is one, and this is one that's relatively easy to do in a hospital setting. You can do a glucose tolerance test and measure 2 hours after 75 grams of glucose. You can measure the 2-hour glucose, and if that's greater than or equal to 11.1 millimoles per liter, then that also qualifies as a diagnosis of diabetes. If a patient walks into your GP surgery and they haven't been fasting, and you don't have time to do a glucose tolerance test, you can just take a random glucose sample, and if that's greater than 11.1 and they have symptoms of diabetes, which we'll come back to in a few minutes, well then that also qualifies as a diagnostic criterion. And the final one is an HbA1c of greater than or equal to 48 millimoles per mole, or 6.5%. So these are the criteria for diabetes. You can see that I've also quoted you here what's normal for each of these parameters. And between normal and the diabetes cutoff, there is what we would consider a pre-diabetes range. So, for example, with the 2-hour glucose in a glucose tolerance test, normal is less than 7.8. If it's above 7.8, but not as high as 11.1, we call that impaired glucose tolerance. And we know that people with impaired glucose tolerance are more likely to go on and develop type 2 diabetes. So in terms of classification, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes would make up the vast majority of the diabetes that we would see. And many of you who've been out in the wards will have seen patients with both of these conditions. So type 2 diabetes we would think probably is about 85 to 90%, and the bulk of the remainder of patients with diabetes would have type 1 diabetes. We also talk about gestational diabetes, which is detected for the first time usually during the 2nd or 3rd trimester of pregnancy, and has not been there prior to the woman becoming pregnant. And then there are a small group of other specific subtypes of diabetes. So there are some monogenic syndromes. We call these maturity onset diabetes of the young because they tend to present early in life, usually before the age of 25. And they're autosomal dominantly inherited, so there's usually 3 or 4 generations of diabetes in those families. If you have exocrine pancreatic disease, so patients who've had acute pancreatitis, for example, can also develop diabetes. Drug-induced diabetes, the classic example here obviously is steroids, which we use as anti-inflammatories in a lot of patients with chronic inflammatory conditions. And then there are some other specific endocrinopathies such as acromegaly or Cushing's syndrome that can be associated with diabetes. But as I say, the vast majority of patients have either type 1 or type 2 diabetes. So it was mentioned by our dean that this is a big problem everywhere, right around the world. And these are data from this year's IDF Atlas. They're actually data from 2017, but looking at the prevalence of diabetes globally. And you can see that in 2017, it was estimated that there were 425 million people with diabetes worldwide. And it's projected that that will increase to 629 million by 2045. So this is a massive problem. And you can see it's not just, we might expect perhaps in North America or Europe that this is happening. It's right around the world. So even in Africa, Middle East, North Africa, North America, and the Caribbean, South America, Central America, Western Pacific, and so on. So it's really right around the world that we have a massive problem in terms of prevalence of diabetes. Now, if you look at diabetes with increasing age, you can see that obviously the number increases. So diabetes is something that happens more commonly as we get older. And we sometimes think that maybe if we all could live long enough, we'd all develop diabetes, because as we age, we become less active. And so we gain weight, and these are factors that contribute to the development of diabetes. And you can see that right throughout the ages, really, it's more common in males and females, except really at the end of life, when probably males tend to die younger, and so there are actually more women around. So generally, it's a disease of more common in males and females. With the prevalence as substantial as it is, it's no surprise that diabetes is a very costly disease. And you can see here, again, from the IDF Atlas of this year, the 2017 estimated cost of diabetes in the various continents. So it's a massively expensive disease. And we know that the vast majority of the money that we spend on diabetes is spent on managing complications. You might think it's expensive treatments, but in fact, managing the complications, which we'll talk about further in the lecture, is really where most of the expense is incurred. And of course, it does shorten life if it's not managed successfully. And you can see here the human health costs in terms of the number of deaths due to diabetes in 2017. And again, emphasizing that this is truly a worldwide problem. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the pathophysiology of the two main types of diabetes. So type 1 diabetes, as many of you will be familiar, is an autoimmune process. So in other words, the body's immune system is attacking and damaging the insulin-making cells in the pancreas. And this is an example here of an islet of Langerhans. It doesn't look normal, so these pink cytoplasmic cells here are the normal beta cells, but most of these small, darker stained nuclei are lymphocytes, and those lymphocytes have migrated into the islets, and they're damaging the beta cells, and ultimately end up completely destroying all the beta cells in the pancreas, or pretty much all of the beta cells. And this is often referred to as insulitis. So eventually, diabetes will develop when there is not enough insulin left to control the blood sugars. And we think that ultimately, most people with type 1 diabetes will progress to complete insulin deficiency. And obviously, this has implications for treatment. If you don't have enough insulin around, then you need to have insulin replaced. We can detect the autoimmune process by measuring antibodies in the patient's blood, and there are a variety of these which we often use to confirm that the diagnosis is type 1 diabetes. Ketoacidosis can occur, and again, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the fact that fat is broken down to keto acids, and in the absence of insulin, we can't use glucose or carbohydrate as a source of energy, and so we break down our fat stores, and the end product of that are keto acids, and when they build up, they can cause the patient to become extremely ill in a situation of diabetic ketoacidosis. And so the treatment requires insulin. We need insulin to restore normal glucose to prevent diabetic ketoacidosis. Type 2 diabetes is quite different, or at least our current thinking of type 2 diabetes is quite different. We do know that there are particular people who are at risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Would anybody like to volunteer some of the at-risk groups? Yes? Obesity, that's a big risk factor for type 2 diabetes. So we know that 85% of patients with type 2 diabetes are obese or overweight. So that's an important risk factor. Anybody else like to? Yeah? Smokers, not particularly, not one of the big risk factors. Behind you? Yeah. So people with cardiovascular disease are certainly more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, and vice versa. People with type 2 diabetes are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease. Yeah. Exactly. So family history is a very important risk factor for type 2 diabetes. So a significant proportion of the patients we see will have a family member, a first-degree relative, either parent or sibling who has type 2 diabetes. And what we think is that the body becomes resistant to insulin, and that predates the development of diabetes, sometimes by decades. So you can see here, as an individual moves through life, their insulin resistance it's greater. So they're gaining weight, they're less active, and so they're becoming more insulin resistant. In the early stages, the pancreas can compensate and make enough insulin so that the blood sugar doesn't rise. But in certain individuals, then, that compensatory mechanism will fail, the insulin level will start to drop, and the patient's blood sugars will start to rise. So this is a bit more complex than the pure insulin deficiency of type 1 diabetes. And that obviously has implications for treatment too in type 2 diabetes. So this is a slide from a lecture by one of the famous diabetologists in the States, Ralph DeFronzo, and this is from a lecture he gave at the American Diabetes Association in 1988. And this was his thinking at the time, that there were three main organs that were involved in type 2 diabetes. So he talked about the skeletal muscles, and these are where the insulin resistance resides. So there's reduced insulin sensitivity and reduced glucose uptake. The liver is one of the main jobs of the liver is to make sure that we don't become hypoglycemic when we fast, and it does that by making glucose. And this process can become uncontrolled in people with type 2 diabetes. And then obviously the pancreas, and there was an impairment of insulin secretion as I outlined, and that was the thinking in 1988. Move forward 21 years, and the same guy giving another lecture at the American Diabetes Association, and now he's talking about 8 different tissues. The ominous octet is what he calls them, that are involved in type 2 diabetes. So he's still talking about the skeletal muscle, the liver, the pancreas, but in addition, the fat cells. Okay, so the fat cells are releasing more free fatty acids, which impair insulin secretion, and so they're involved. Increased glucose reabsorption in the kidneys. We do know that as the kidneys filter more glucose, they'll try to reabsorb it. It's a natural body response, and that can make the sugar level worse in the blood. The brain is thought to be involved, and the various neurotransmitters that may function aberrantly in patients with type 2 diabetes. Increased glucagon secretion. We talked about glucagon being the main hormone that pushes the blood sugar up, and we now appreciate that the alpha cells are also involved, the cells that make glucagon. So they hypersecrete glucagon. And then there's a decreased incretin effect. So incretins are hormones that are made by the gut that affect the level of insulin and glucagon. And we know that they predominantly stimulate insulin secretion, so a diminished incretin effect will potentially raise the blood glucose. So there are a lot of different tissues that we now appreciate play a role in the development of type 2 diabetes. So you can see it's a very complicated condition. So the clinical features of diabetes, these you'll recognize from Areteus of Cappadocia's description. Predominantly thirst, excess urination, what we talk of as osmotic symptoms of diabetes. Weight loss can be a common symptom, particularly in type 1 diabetes. There can be dramatic weight loss in the weeks before presentation. Fatigue, most people with diabetes will say they feel very tired when their sugars are not well controlled. Blurred vision due to swelling of the lens in the eye. An increased tendency to infections. So we know the glucose being high impairs the immune system and impairs function of the immune system and makes you more likely to develop infections. And then obviously the acute presentation of DKA that I mentioned, that's a hallmark of type 1 diabetes. So we move on to talk a little bit about the history of diabetes again, and so moving on to treatment. So these are two guys, von Mering and Oskar Minkowski. Anybody know what they discovered and what? I presume you all read this paper in advance of the lecture today, so I'm sure you'll all be able to tell me what they discovered. Okay, well, I didn't really expect you to read it, but what they did, actually, von Mering was interested in lipid metabolism and felt that it was something to do with the pancreas. And following discussion with Minkowski, they decided to take the pancreas out to look at the effect of on lipid metabolism. What they actually produced in dogs, they actually made the dogs diabetic. So this is really the first demonstration that diabetes was a pancreatic disease. So a very seminal work back in the late 19th century. We then move on about 20 years. I'm assuming that there is probably a student or more than one student from Toronto in the room. Yeah, at least one hand at the back. We have a lot of Canadians in RCSI, and they're very frequently from around the Toronto area. So insulin was discovered at the University of Toronto, and these are the guys credited with the discovery of insulin. So this is Banting and this is Best. Banting was a surgeon, And he actually, I think his career wasn't going very well in surgery, so he was looking to do some research, and that's how he got into researching, and the research eventually led to the discovery of insulin. And for those medical students in the room, Best was a medical student who got involved in the research, and you can see it had very, very far-reaching consequences. So in late 1921, following a series of experiments on dogs where they took out the pancreas, made them diabetic, and then tried to extract insulin from the pancreas and give it back to the dogs, they delivered this lecture. And this led to the discovery of insulin and the confirmation that insulin was the hormone that controls glucose, and that's what's missing in people with type 1 diabetes. And this is the original paper, so published in, as you can see, in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 1922. So 1922 was the year that insulin was first used, and so we're coming around to the centenary of insulin, and there will be great celebrations at the University of Toronto in 2022. They're already being organized to commemorate the discovery of insulin. And this was really an N of 1 experiment. So they took one young man with type 1 diabetes, and they gave him the extracts from dogs' pancreases, which contain the insulin. And you can see here, this looking at the effect on glycosuria. So this is the first dose that you got, and then with subsequent doses, you can see each time that somebody insulin extract was given, the amount of sugar released in the urine reduced. And this is looking at the effect of one dose on his blood glucose, so you can see there's a drop in the glucose. The ketone production was also inhibited by the administration of the insulin. So beneficial effects presented as data from one patient in this scientific journal 100 years ago. And this is the patient, so you can see this is him before and after insulin. These are photographs that are available on the internet. So this is Leonard Thompson, and you can see how emaciated and sick-looking he looked on December the 15th, 1922. And he wouldn't have lasted much longer after that, obviously. Effectively, type 1 diabetes was a death sentence in those days because there was no treatment for it. On the 11th of January of that year, he got his first dose of insulin, and by a month later, he's transformed because he looks much healthier. And he went on to live to an age of 37. Still, he died prematurely from an infection, but he got an extra 20 years of life, 23 years of life that he would not have had but for the discovery of Banting and Best. So we've seen quite an evolution of insulin administration over the years, and these were some of the syringes that were originally used. They're very cumbersome looking and unwieldy looking ways of administering the insulin. When I trained in the United States, we were still using these plastic syringes, 1 ml syringes, but still using insulin syringes and drawing the insulin up from a vial and administering it. We moved on then to insulin pens, which you will see most patients will use nowadays, and there'll be different types of insulin, fast-acting and long-acting. And then what we're moving more and more to is administering insulin through one of these pumps, which continuously infuses the insulin and means that the patient doesn't have to take 12 injections every 3 days. They change this set every 3 days, and inside here is a little spring-loaded syringe which continuously infuses the insulin. And this is the best way we think we have currently of administering the insulin for patients with type 1 diabetes. Might pause just for a minute. Let's go back to Mentimeter and ask you a few more questions and see if you're still awake. So, approximately how many people are living with diabetes in Ireland, would you say? Is it 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, 500,000, or 1 million? Okay, so most people are favouring 300,000. It is actually probably somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. This is usually the figure that's most often quoted, but the problem in Ireland in terms of prevalence of diabetes, we really have very little clue. We don't have a national diabetes register, and it really limits our knowledge in terms of epidemiology of diabetes in the country. So we think it's probably maybe 225,000, something in that order. Move on to another question. What test is used as the primary indicator of good glycemic control? Is it the fasting glucose, the fructosamine, hemoglobin A1C, postprandial glucose, or urine ketones? So we have 100 answers in, and it's divided between fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C. In truth, we would use both of those. But if we want to determine whether somebody's meeting targets for their glycemic control, it's usually the HbA1c that we'll look at. And we'll come back to the reason for that again in a few minutes' time. So let's go back to our slides. So we talked about the insulin treatment evolving, and move on to the next slide. So monitoring diabetes control is something that's changed dramatically. And back in the day, the doctors used to taste the urine to see if they had patients had diabetes. So this very distinguished, intelligent-looking person here is obviously the consultant. And here is the poor medical student, terrified of what the consultant's going to ask him to do. But thankfully, we've moved on from that. The reason to show you some ants here is that the ancient Indians had a way of detecting glucose in the urine. And what they did was take a bowl of urine and a bowl of water. They'd upturn them outside and look at which bowl the ants followed. So the ants would obviously be attracted by the sugar. So that was how they diagnosed diabetes back in ancient India. When I was in medical school, this was the typical way we had of measuring glucose. So patients dipped their urine, and they had to look at a colored strip. And based on the color of the strip, it would tell them whether they had a lot of sugar in their urine or not. And it was great excitement back in the 80s when these machines came out. They're glucometers. And what the patients do with these, obviously, is prick their finger, put a little drop of the blood on the strip here, and that tells them what their blood sugar is. And most patients, we would ask them to do that 4 or 5 times a day. But that only gives you information about 5 seconds, essentially, in the day. If you ask a patient to repeat that test 10, 15 minutes after they've done it, it could be quite different. So we really need more information about what the blood sugar is doing over the course of a day. And so we've really moved into an era of technology now in type 1 diabetes. And this is an example of what's called a flash glucose monitor. This is the Freestyle Libre. It stays on the upper arm like this for about 2 weeks. There's a sensor. A little lead goes under the skin, and it's continuously measuring the glucose level in the interstitial fluid, which obviously reflects the glucose in the blood. And using this little glucometer here, if you run it over the sensor, every 8 hours you'll record an entire 24 hours worth of blood glucose readings. And that gives you lots more information, and it can make it much easier to see trends. You can see here, you now have a full 24-hour profile of the blood glucose, and you can determine how much time they're within their target range, in this case 83%, which is excellent. So that's how the technology is moving. And you can see in this slide here the impact of that flash glucose monitoring on HbA1c. So these are data from before the patient started using the flash glucose monitor, and these are afterwards. And you can see the proportion achieving an HbA1c less than 7.5%, or 58 millimoles per mole, has increased. And the proportion achieving a target between 7.5 and 9 has also increased, and fewer people are in the higher range. So really, these are impacting on patients' lives. And we know Anna Clark is here from Diabetes Ireland, and Diabetes Ireland has done a study in patients who are using these, and the biggest message that's coming out from that research is that the lives are transformed. Patients really feel it takes a lot of the difficulty out of managing their diabetes and improves their quality of life. And what we're really moving to is what we call an artificial pancreas, where we will have a sensor like that flash glucose monitor that's continuously measuring the interstitial fluid glucose, and it's linked to a pump which administers the insulin, and then there's a controller which has an algorithm. So this is continuously adjusting the insulin in the pump based on what the sensor is telling it. And these devices are now available in research settings, and I would think over the next 5 to 10 years we'll see them coming into mainstream use in people with type 1 diabetes. So we're going to talk a bit about the complications. I'm sure most of you have heard of diabetes and related complications. We talk about microvascular complications, which are due to small vessel damage, and we also talk about macrovascular complications, or large vessel damage. So diabetic nephropathy is an example of microvascular disease. And diabetes is the leading cause of end-stage renal disease in Ireland and most other Western countries. It's also the leading cause of blindness in working-age adults. So as we move into the older age group, age-related macular degeneration becomes much more common. But in the working population, the commonest cause of blindness is diabetes. In terms of cardiovascular disease, there's a 2 to 4-fold increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And this is unfortunately the reason that many people meet their demise with diabetes. And then diabetic neuropathy is the third microvascular complication that we think of. So the neuropathy, the nephropathy, and the retinopathy are the microvascular complications. Stroke and cardiovascular disease are the macrovascular complications. So diabetic neuropathy is a leading cause of lower extremity amputation. And these are a couple of examples of a normal retina here on the left, and on the right, a retina in somebody with diabetic retinopathy. So you can see there are dilated vessels here. These areas are yellow. They're areas of exudates and edema in the retina. And these are all markers of diabetic retinopathy. And we know that we can prevent this now with a very effective national retinal screening program. So I mentioned that insulin was used for the first time in 1922. This study was published in 1992, 70 years later, and this is the first study that showed that good blood sugar control actually prevents the complications of diabetes and type 1 diabetes. So it's incredible to think that it took 70 years to organize this kind of a study to conclusively show the benefits in the long term of good glycemic control. And it was true whether the patients started out having complications here on the left, or whether they already had complications at the time of diagnosis or at the time of recruitment to the trial. Once they got into the trial and were managed in the intensively treated group, and you can see there was a lower rate of complications here. The HbA1c group, the HbA1c in the intensive group was 7.2%, and it was 1.8% lower than in the control group. So that might seem like a fairly modest reduction in HbA1c, 1.8%, but when maintained over a number of years, on an average about 5 years for most of these candidates in the study, effectively reduced the risk of microvascular complications. So this was great excitement in the diabetes world back in 1992 when this study was published. And these are epidemiologic data looking at the risk of retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, and microalbuminuria, all microvascular complications of diabetes, and looking at the relationship with HbA1c based on the DCCT study. And you can see that obviously the higher the HbA1c, the higher the risk of all of these complications. But when you get to an HbA1c of around 7%, then your risk of complications is very minimal. It's slightly increased, but very minimally increased. And so that's where the target HbA1c of 7%, or 53 millimoles per mole in the new units, comes from. What we also learned from the DCCT is that there is what we call metabolic memory. So if you have a period of good blood sugar control, even after that period of good blood sugar control, if you let your control slip a little bit, the period of good control stands to you in the long term. So this is what happened to the HbA1c. We talked about the 1.8% difference during the DCCT. After the study completed, they followed the patients, and you can see effectively their sugar control was the same. But this is looking at risk of retinopathy after the study, and those curves continue to diverge. So these are the intensively treated group, now with the same blood sugar levels as this group, but the benefit from the previous 5 years has stood the test of time, and they're continuing to benefit from that. So a very important study. We're going to move on and talk now a little bit about type 2 diabetes, and I've mentioned already how complicated a condition it is. So we've talked about the various tissues that are involved in type 2 diabetes, and when we come to think about treatments then, nowadays what we're starting to try and think about is what is the main organ or tissue that has contributed to the diabetes in this individual. So we have sulfonylureas and meglitinides. These are tablets, and they stimulate insulin release. So we know that patients with type 2 diabetes lack insulin, relatively, so making more insulin might be beneficial and is beneficial. We have what we call biguanides or metformin, which predominantly works on the liver and reduces the hepatic glucose output that I talked about, contributing to the high glucose in patients with type 2 diabetes. We have alpha-glucosidase inhibitors, and what they do is inhibit the final step in the breakdown of carbohydrates in the gut. So they slow carbohydrate or glucose absorption postprandially. And so for anybody with a high postprandial glucose, they can be helpful. We have the thiazolidine diones, and they they improve insulin sensitivity. So they work in skeletal muscle and adipose tissue particularly, improving insulin sensitivity, which you may recall from my pathophysiology description of type 2 diabetes is probably the main reason why patients develop diabetes in the first place. We now have what we call incretins and DPP4 inhibitors. So incretins are injections. They are synthetic incretins. I mentioned the incretins and how they stimulate insulin release and suppress glucagon. So they're injected treatments, and the DPP4 inhibitors are tablet medications which inhibit the breakdown of endogenous incretins. The net effect of each of these is to give you more incretin effect, more stimulation of insulin release, and more inhibition of glucagon. Then we have the SGLT2 inhibitors, the most recent addition to the type 2 diabetes armamentarium, if you like to call it that. And what they do is they slow down or impair the glucose reabsorption by the kidneys. And that reduces the glucose in the blood. And then, of course, we can have insulin as well, which can compensate for many of these pathophysiologic defects. And I talked in some extent about the DCCT, and this is a similar study, the United Kingdom Prospective Diabetes Study, which was presented in 1998. Again, the first study that conclusively showed that type 2 diabetes, when well controlled, you can prevent the complications. So you're looking at microvascular endpoints here, a 25% reduction with good glycemic control. And in this study, there was only a 1% difference in HbA1c between the intensively treated group and the control group. So a 1% difference in HbA1c maintained over a long period of time has benefits in terms of preventing the complications. What was disappointing about this study, you can look at the p-value here, was that myocardial infarction, which is really the big killer in type 2 diabetes, was not reduced at the end of the study. These were all newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes patients who were recruited into the trial. So the thinking at the time was they hadn't followed them long enough to see the benefit in cardiovascular disease. And when they followed them forward for another 10 years, they did find a statistically significant reduction in myocardial infarction in the patients who were recruited to the UK PDS. So again, another landmark study in the history of diabetes in type 2 in this instance. And empagliflozin is one of the SGLT2 inhibitors. Remember, I said these drugs impair renal reabsorption of glucose. And this study was presented actually at the European Association for the Study of Diabetes in 2015 and published on the same day in the New England Journal of Medicine. This study was actually performed because it is now mandated by the authorities in the US that any new diabetes drug has to demonstrate that there is no cardiovascular deleterious effects before it can be approved for use in humans. And so this was really a study that was performed to make sure that empagliflozin did not have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. In actual fact, what it showed was that empagliflozin reduces cardiovascular outcomes and reduces heart failure admissions and reduces mortality in patients with type 2 diabetes. And we really hadn't seen that before with any particular diabetes drug for type 2 diabetes. So when this study was published on the slide showing the benefit in terms of cardiovascular disease in a massive hall with thousands of people in it, there was a round of applause, and I've never seen that before at a scientific meeting. But people were just so delighted to see that we now had something that we could give to our patients, which was going to reduce their risk of developing cardiovascular complications. And since that study, 2 other drugs in the same family have produced similar results. There's always a downside to every treatment, as you know. And so these are data from the DCCT, basically showing that as HbA1c comes down, you can see this is looking at hypoglycemia here. So as your HbA1c comes down, your risk of hypoglycemia goes up. Now, obviously, that's dependent on what treatment you use for type 2 diabetes. But most of the treatments at that time would have included insulin and sulfonylureas would be associated with potential for hypoglycemia. So many of the drugs we still use have that potential. I've talked about how common type 2 diabetes is, and one of the important questions in the diabetes world was, is this condition preventable? And in this slide here, you can see the data from a US study, the Diabetes Prevention Program. And what I've done in this study is to take a group of high-risk people, so they're people with impaired glucose tolerance or impaired fasting glucose, what I call pre-diabetes. So we know that these people are at an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And they've randomized them to 3 groups, a placebo group, a metformin group, this is one of the treatments, remember I said it reduces hepatic glucose output, or an intensive lifestyle group. So the placebo group just got general advice about diet and exercise. The intensive lifestyle group had a 4-month period where they had very, very close attention to their diet and exercise under very close supervision and had very intensive follow-up over the years of the study. So significant lifestyle changes. And then in between was a metformin group who had the same diet and lifestyle advice as the placebo group, but also took metformin. And you can see that the lifestyle intervention produced a 58% reduction in type 2 diabetes. So a very significant prevention, or at least delay in the development of type 2 diabetes in that intervention group. Metformin was also effective, but not as effective as the lifestyle intervention. So this is a very important message. And many countries have taken this on board and have developed diabetes prevention programs. And this is one of the priorities currently for our national diabetes program here in this country, led by Sean Deneen, looking at trying to develop a diabetes intervention that can be applied generally in the population at risk of developing diabetes so that we can start reducing our incidence and our prevalence of type 2 diabetes. Celine, you haven't told me if I got to 30 minutes yet.
You're nearly at 40.
Okay, so I'm doing fine. The ultimate question, I suppose, if you prevent diabetes is, does preventing diabetes prevent complications? And this is a meta-analysis from just published this year, systematic review of the literature from this year. And to be honest, the results are a little bit disappointing. So there's a reduction in retinopathy, and that's it. So they didn't see reductions in nephropathy or neuropathy. But you have to remember that when you're looking at diabetes prevention programs, you're taking people who don't yet have diabetes. So it may take many, many years for them to have enough exposure to hyperglycemia for us to be able to demonstrate the benefits of diabetes prevention in terms of complication prevention. So intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. If you prevent diabetes, that you would have to prevent the complications, but that might be very challenging for us to demonstrate. Let's go back to our Mentimeter again. I think there's a couple more questions there I plan to ask you. So what is the usual first-line treatment for type 2 diabetes? Is it acarbose, DPP-4 inhibitor, metformin, sulfonylurea, or thiazolidinedione? Almost about 100, and the vast majority of people voting for metformin, which is correct. So metformin is usually the treatment we use first. A number of the reasons for that are we have a lot of experience with it. We've had 50, 60 years experience with it. It doesn't cause weight gain, which a lot of diabetes medications do. And obviously, if you've got somebody who's overweight or obese, you don't want them to gain weight. And so metformin is usually our first-line treatment. And I think that was my last question. And we're almost at the end of the lecture. So just to summarize, what I've told you today, and hope you have the take-home message, is that diabetes is a common and costly chronic condition, and its prevalence is increasing throughout the world, including here in Ireland. It comprises a group of disorders with type 2 diabetes being the most common form. Poor control can lead to complications, and we've talked about the various complications that it can arise. I've shown you the relatively recent evidence that treatment of diabetes and effective treatment of diabetes is effective in terms of preventing the complications. I've emphasized the role of technology, particularly in type 1 diabetes, and how that is really transforming the lives of many people living with type 1 diabetes. The very important message from the DPP that type 2 diabetes can be prevented. And effective preventative programs are needed, and this should reduce the burden of the condition. And we hold our hands up as a diabetes community in this country to say we don't still have, almost 20 years after the DPP was published, we still don't have a diabetes prevention program in the country. But of course, that's a resource issue, and it's something we're working on and hopefully will come into effect in the next couple of years. So thank you for your attention, and as I said, I'm happy to take some questions.
Sreenan, and thank you for giving us a really wonderful start from the history of diabetes. And of course, we think it's the history now because it's almost 2 millennia ago. But when these people started, they were the innovators. So
Absolutely.
it's really interesting to see how innovation happens kind of by good clinical observation, by accident sometimes, and by good experimentation, whether it's, for example, the dogs in Toronto or by human clinical trials. So it's wonderful to hear that. You've heard about the burden of disease. So certainly for the duration of your careers, whether you're medical, physiotherapy or pharmacy students or postgraduate students with a research interest, this is going to be a big issue for all of your careers. And Professor Sreenan talked about the ominous octet in terms of the challenges around diabetes. And really what you'd like to see by the end of your careers is that we have the optimistic octet. What are the things that you in your careers and the people that you will work with will do to make diabetes a disease that's on the decrease rather than on the increase? And we have seen that in other disorders. I think at the start of our career, we've seen much heavier burdens of cardiovascular disease in countries like Ireland, and we have really made great inroads. It's still the biggest killer in Ireland, cardiovascular disease, but people are living much longer before they succumb. So hopefully many of you in your careers will contribute to the reduction in diabetes or will observe inspiring colleagues who are doing the same. So we're going to have some questions now for Professor Sreenan. Since he asked you questions, you can ask him some hard questions back. So anybody like to start off with the first question?
Yeah.
How often someone that develops diabetes during the pregnancy can develop diabetes type 2 later? You know, like.
Yeah, so I didn't mention that, but obviously one of the risk factors for developing type 2 diabetes is a history of gestational diabetes, so that's an excellent question. And we do know that normally, so the reason that women develop gestational diabetes is probably that they have a tendency to develop diabetes before they become pregnant. And during pregnancy, there are very high levels of hormones such as human placental lactogen, which make the woman even more insulin resistant. And that is a challenge to the beta cells in the pancreas, and so they can't cope when those hormone levels are very high. But immediately after the pregnancy, those hormone levels come back down to normal, and the blood sugars usually drop down. So when you're going to your obstetrics and gynecology hospitals later on, you'll see women coming back who've had gestational diabetes. They're usually brought back at 6 weeks, and they will frequently have a glucose tolerance test to determine their glycemic status. And many of them will be normal, but we do know that they have an increased risk, substantially increased risk, and so they always need to be checked regularly to determine whether they're developing diabetes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Somebody from the yellow group. We've had the pink group. Somebody from the yellow group. Yes, thank you.
I would like to ask about the drug-induced diabetes. So, for example, if I have a patient with a rheumatoid arthritis flare-up and he should be on steroids for 2 or 3 months, should I give him medications, or what is the intervention for these short times of drug-induced diabetes?
So the first question is, I think anybody who's going to be on steroids for any significant length of time should have their glycemic status assessed before they commence on the steroids. So you should measure fasting glucose ideally and HbA1c before they start steroids, and then monitor their blood sugar, particularly in the early stages after they start on the steroids, because usually the sugar, if it's going to go up, will go up very quickly. Obviously, it's dose dependent. So with some of these inflammatory conditions, you might be using, like with giant cell arteritis, you could be using 60 or 80 milligrams of prednisone a day, whopping doses. So that will push the blood sugar up very, very quickly. And then it really depends, the intervention that you would use to treat them depends on how high their blood sugar is. Very often we need to use insulin in those patients in the short term, even though when they come off the steroids, their blood sugars may come back down, they may be normal, and they might not need any treatment. Sometimes we can get away with medication, so metformin can be a good one to use in that setting as well, but it really depends on how high the blood sugars are.
Thank you. Anybody in the purple group for a question? Yes?
Yes, they are. It's probably more related to the obesity, but so we do know that people who are obese are prone to a lot of different cancers, esophageal cancers, uterine cancer, breast cancer, and so on. And I think a lot of the increase that you see in people with diabetes is probably obesity related, because most of the type 2 population are certainly obese. And one of the things that's come out with metformin in the last few years, well, a lot of epidemiologic research, large cohorts of patients who have been treated with metformin seem to perhaps have slightly lower risks of certain cancers. So it seems that it may have some beneficial effect. I was talking about the DPP there, and just forgot to mention that what we've learned from the diabetes prevention program is that patients who have impaired glucose tolerance at risk of diabetes have about a 7% chance per year of going on to develop type 2 diabetes. So that's obviously a cumulative thing. So if you follow them for 10 years, there's a 70% chance of them developing type 2 diabetes. And it's an important to intervene as early as possible to prevent not just the diabetes, but other long-term effects such as the increased risk of cancer.
And there's a question over here on the far side, and I think two here. We might give you a break.
Okay.
From up at the back there was a question, yes.
What inhibits patient compliance when it comes to adhering to diabetes medication?
Well, obviously that's a very individual thing. So we do know that there's a big issue with diabetes, with adherence to medication in people with diabetes. So I suppose it's different in type 1 and type 2 diabetes as well. So type 1 diabetes can be more of a burden in some ways on the individual because they have to check their blood sugars, we advise them that they have to check their blood sugars 4+ times a day. And this is where having something like those flash glucose monitors takes away some of that burden. But lots of people just don't even check their blood sugars at all. They have to take insulin 4 times a day. You know, if you want to really control your sugar, you need to know how much insulin to give. You can't really determine how much insulin to give if you're not checking your blood sugars. And it's a pain, you know, particularly if you're a young adolescent. You're very different from the rest of your cohort. You don't want to be seen very often giving insulin. So it can be a very, very difficult time. And of course, obviously, we're advising young adolescents with type 1 diabetes to look at their diet. Most of their contemporaries don't have to worry about what they eat, but people with diabetes do. So there's a lot of things that they have to do. It can be a huge burden on the individual. In patients with type 2 diabetes, really the most important thing for them is to change their lifestyle. So I talked about the medications, and I really should have emphasized the role of lifestyle management as part of that condition as well. So we advise all those people to exercise more, to try and get their weight down, and obviously to adhere to a healthy diet. But they've developed those unhealthy lifestyles, if you like, over many years, so it can be very, very difficult for them to change. Again, they can be on several medications. So type 2 diabetes often goes along with dyslipidemia, with heart disease, with hypertension, with other comorbidities. So they can be taking 10, 12 tablets a day, and so it just becomes a huge burden. And it can affect their mood and their quality of life. And many of them will suffer with some degree of depression, and that can also impact on whether they adhere to their medication or not.
Two questions here. You first. Yeah.
What's the first step on a national level that needs to be taken to reduce the incidence of diabetes?
Well, excellent question. I mean, I think first thing we need to do in this country is, probably in most countries, is to resource a diabetes prevention program. I think we know what we need to do. I mean, we have several diabetes prevention programs. I only showed you data from one, but there are other diabetes studies. We know that lifestyle intervention is the most effective way to do it, but it's quite labor intensive, as I try to emphasize in talking about the diabetes prevention program there. You need very regular contact with dietitians, with people who can advise you about exercise, and people who can keep the enthusiasm up with that prevention program, because a lot of people can do it for a short period of time, but maintaining it in the long term is really the challenge. So we have to identify those at risk as well, and I think our GPs are actually very good at doing that now. The GPs are aware how common diabetes is. They are screening, so I think we're probably ahead of the curve in that respect. But then having an intervention program that's adequately resourced with all the personnel and funding behind it is really the step.
There was another question in medical there.
The question was very related to the last two questions. As specifically here in Ireland, with the increased number of diabetics, like here in Ireland, like especially outside Dublin, like in smaller villages and towns, what are the most practical interventions to help them outside Dublin?
So obviously lifestyle change, it can be more difficult if you're in a rural area. We can tell people living in Dublin to go maybe to the nearest park or to the gym or whatever to exercise, or at least they can go out and walk on the road and they have a pavement to walk on. But somebody in the country, it's much more difficult. Plus, they may not have access to the same degree of food choices as we would have living in an urban environment. So it is a challenge, but obviously lifestyle change is the way to go for everybody.
Maybe one last question over here then.
Is there any gene therapy-based targeted beating support for type 1 diabetes?
I haven't seen any gene therapy, but so the way type 1 diabetes, I didn't really talk about prevention of type 1 diabetes, and part of the reason that we're not currently at a stage where we can prevent it very successfully. But so there are some immunotherapies now that are directed at intervening in people and family members of people with type 1 diabetes, and there's some progress in that. There could be some gene therapy, but I certainly haven't seen it.
Thank you. And I guess also it's different in different countries, but certainly in terms of what we might call social engineering, in this country in the last year we've imposed a sugar tax on soft drinks to try to in a way encourage companies to reduce the level of sugar in drinks. And again, you're from very different countries in the world, and we would see that even in social situations where in many countries we would travel to. Some countries you're always offered a glass of water to drink. In other countries you're offered a glass which has always got added sugar. And so there are different challenges in different countries, but that would be seen as not just the diabetes fraternity in Ireland, but also the cardiovascular and cancer, and a whole range of NGOs and patient groups as you know, a small but significant success right across the country in terms of reducing just the sugar volume that we're all used to. So those kinds of interventions are also very important in terms of preventing and reducing the exacerbation of conditions. So I think we just say thank you again, Professor Sreenan, for a really insightful lecture. Thank you. Thank you. And I know Professor Marvin wants me to confirm that we clocked in 60 nationalities. One person from one nationality may have left, so we may have 59 in the room, but we're well over our 50. So I don't think there's any doubt that we won't meet all of the criteria for achieving a world record. But you've got an MCQ to do in the meantime. So. Well done, everybody. I'm not sure who's going to hand out the MCQ forms. Is that Karina? Oh, our assistants are going to do that. So this is summative. This is formative. Oops. This is formative. And it's really another form of evidence for Guinness Book of Records that you were here and that you answered a set of questions and you were listening to a very successful lecturer.
Has everybody handed up their MCQ answer sheet?
Okay, so if we just wait 1 more minute, we're just going to officially close the proceedings. So just 1 more moment, please. Thank you.
So as you know, we love giving you feedback on your MCQs here in RCSI, so I'm just going to run through the answers very quickly on those questions, and hopefully I included all the information in the lecture. So the first one was, when was insulin first used to treat type 1 diabetes? And your options were 1889, 1901, 1922, 1939, or 1945. Correct answer there was 1922. To whom was the Nobel Prize awarded for the discovery of insulin? You should have been able to answer this based on the lecture. So the correct option there was Banting and MacLeod. Question 3, at what institution was insulin discovered? McGill, Queen's, University of British Columbia, University of Calgary, or the University of Toronto? And it was the University of Toronto. So any University of Toronto alums can be very proud of that. What is the most common form of diabetes? And that's obviously type 2 diabetes. At what level of fasting glucose is a diagnosis of diabetes made? Correct answer there was greater than or equal to 7. At what level of HbA1c is a diagnosis of diabetes made? Correct answer there was greater than or equal to 48. Approximately what proportion of people with pre-diabetes will develop type 2 diabetes if untreated? And the correct answer there was 7%. I remembered I hadn't said that until afterwards. What medication was shown to prevent diabetes in the DPP? And the correct answer there was metformin. What hormone level is reduced by GLP-1 analogues? That was probably the most difficult question. And the options were adrenaline, cortisol, glucagon, growth hormone, or insulin. Correct answer there is glucagon. And finally, what was the main conclusion of the diabetes control and complications trial? I won't read them all out, but it was basically that good glycemic control prevents the complications of diabetes.
What's the last one?
No repeat on this one, unfortunately. If you didn't pass, it's okay.
Just to say, yeah, well done. Thank you. Again, just thank you to everybody who helped to organise this, but most important, thank you to you undergraduate and postgraduate students who are here in your 3 colours this evening. We hope to have the answer for this in about a week from Guinness. We can't promise, but we hope to have it fairly soon. When we will get the official confirmation, we'll make sure you all have a personalised named letter to tell you that you are part of a Guinness World Record breaking attempt. as they say, one for everyone in the audience. And we'll also make sure through Professor Marmion that we have some kind of permanent record in the college that people can see that we broke a world record. And let anybody else out there in any other university try to break that. This is a pretty hard one to break. So now, with apologies to Professor Sreenan, there probably are some sugar in the drinks outside, a reception, but one evening won't do any harm. So thank you very much and hope you enjoy the evening and the weekend. Thank you to everybody.